On March 18th, 2025, Christian astronaut Butch Wilmore, which is a perfect astronaut name, splashed down with Crew 9 in a spaceship called Dragon, and thus resolved our own podcast's debate over spaceships versus dragons. Turns out the spaceship called Dragon won. But how many Christians have visited not just the moon or low Earth orbit, but other real planets like Mars by way of fiction? Today, we recap a few Christian-made Martian stories that you may have missed.
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome back aboard Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com in which we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I am me, Stephen Burnett, your captain and the publisher of Lorehaven, as well as the author of my own new science fiction adventure novel launched just last month. And this is episode 256, When Have Newer Christian Authors Explored Mars? I am the captain. I am missing my regent for Zach Russell, usually here in the studio with me, is on an away mission this week, taking some much needed time there. Or maybe it's me who's taking the much needed time. Who knows? By the way, thanks to everyone, all listeners of this podcast who have ordered Above the Circle of Earth. It has been a fantastic launch month, now at the 4-week mark. The novel released on March the 4th. And that's why we're concluding this mini-series on the podcast, Martian Month. By the way, a bit of a subtle April Fool's prank here, overlapping that from the month of March, named after Mars, by the way. But we had just one more episode to go to cover as much as we could, all these different topics related to Mars. This episode, by the way, is our way to include all the authors that we could find, at least in our Lorehaven library, who have explored Mars in some way, who are professing Christian authors and who have enjoyed going to Earth's sister planet. And because some of them have passed on, or some of them are just unavailable, and because time is short for this podcast, we can't interview everybody. So instead, I think I'll just talk about their books. Based mostly on the info that I got from our own Lorehaven library, I found almost all of these titles simply by going to Lorehaven.com and searching for them. The library is entirely searchable. A bunch of thousands, actually, of Christian-made fantastical novels that we list there, and you can sort them by topic, by genre, by author, even by reader ages, so that you can locate the best stories that you or a loved one might enjoy. We also do articles like our Lorehaven on-screen features. Just recently, we ran a retrospective on Cinderella, perhaps the only fantastic Disney remake, and then Parker J. Cole wrote her article about the missing person from the Snow White remake. I know people have a lot of hot takes about that one, but I really appreciated Parker zeroing in on maybe the fatal flaw of that remake, which is the missing prince. The prince is not there. He didn't even leave Prince. He was never in the story. He was replaced by a lovable rogue or some such. And in Parker's view, the story suffers from that, as well as some other issues. Well, we don't just talk about TV and movies at Lorehaven. We also review the best Christian-made fantastical novels like Truth Cursed, the fantasy from Angie Dickinson, just last week. And then this week, coming up, we have a review of Squire of Truth by Jill Williamson. You've heard about that a few times on this show. Well, we finally got somebody to review that. If you missed those reviews, you can catch up to them and keep up by subscribing free at Lorehaven. Join the guild. We'll send you the invite code, and we'll send you any other good stuff that you want in your inbox. Those amazing books include our top sponsor for this episode, Enclave Publishing, with a new title that is releasing just 1 week from now, coming April the 8th. This is called Illuminary, the new novel by Shauna Schroeder. Yosarai Patikan dreams of becoming an illuminator in a country that values art above all else. a lofty goal that finally seems within reach when she earns a position at the prestigious Academy of the Seven Arts. Although J.R.R. loathes to leave behind her quiet country life, she travels to the capital, determined to live up to her mother's fame as one of Indel's greatest artists. Prince Xander never planned to become king. Indeed, he never wanted to become king. But when his father dies suddenly, he is thrust into the middle of coronation preparations and assassination attempts. With everyone around him in increasing danger, Xander decides to hide in neighboring Indel until the time for him to be crowned king arrives. Posing as an inventor struggling with aesthetics, Xander enlists J.R.R.'s aid as part of his cover, but soon he suspects she knows more than she should. But when danger threatens and secrets are exposed, entering a competition reputed as cutthroat may be the only way for them to protect everything they hold dear. Enclave Escape presents Illuminary, the new novel by Shauna Schroeder, author of Beast and The Vault Between Spaces. This novel is coming April the 8th, wherever fantastic books are sold. Ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library, or order it online at Amazon or enclavepublishingstore.com. It's also available in audio from Oasis Audio, and you can see that amazing cover and more info in our show notes for this episode 256, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Let's jump to another world of a Christian-made fantastical series that you may not have heard about that just happens to involve Mars. Interestingly, I got on board this series early. Chapter 1, the Mars Diaries series by author Sigmund Brewer. It's now known as the Robot Wars series, and I can't help but think, well, maybe some people thought, diary? Oh, that must be for girls. No, lads. This is a story for you, okay? There were 10 books originally in the Mars Diaries series, now called Robot Wars, but it's as much for the lads, I think, as it is for the ladies. I remember this series, which released, when was it here? Back in 2001, I think I saw for those old entries in the Lorehaven library. This series actually started on Mars, but then ended up taking a transorbital journey back to Earth, and it revolves around Tice Sanders, the first new person born on Mars in the first colony on Mars, who ends up actually paralyzed. There is a mysterious thing that happened to him back in his past, and now that something in book 1 is happening to the colony that threatens its survival, if I remember correctly, it's been a while since I read it, he learns the reason for his disability and maybe the reason why he has that little plug on him. It turns out, a bit of a spoiler here, that there is a robot that has been made specifically for him to operate by use of micro wires and nanotechnology that enable him to basically possess this special robot. And someone like any of the other colonists on Mars, he can go outside and do great things like save the colony, or save the colony again, or investigate the mysterious objects, or go down inside that cave. It's really fun. The books, originally the 10 books were really short, like maybe a centimeter in length, so very much middle grade chapter books. And as far as I remember, just totally appropriate, fun adventure yarns that harken back to some of the classic sci-fi that you may remember. Very much focused on the boy's adventure. There's a girl and everything. There's some maybe aliens, maybe some mysteries, but it's a very human-centered story with a lot of plot twists and whodunits and some mystery and such. And then eventually, as you go further in the series, there are robot wars and journeys across the Mars-Earth orbital trajectories. Really, really fun stuff. It was later repackaged as 5 books, 2 stories each, in the now renamed Robot Wars series. And the last I saw, those are still available. And a lot of good morals, too, in these books. It's kind of a classic model of Christian-made evangelical publishing back there in the early 2000s. There was a small bout of Mars stories. We'll find out in just a moment what the other one was that I got hold of. But what's kind of fun for me, not just as a fan, but a creator, is I got to enjoy these stories, even though technically they were made for readers younger than me at the time. I got to enjoy these stories as one of the few examples of Christian-made sci-fi that you could find back then from major publishers. The Mars Diaries series, now the Robot Wars series from Sigmund Brewer. Very formative as I think about it. And yet sometimes there's a lot of description about how exactly the robot works. Did I mention it's fast? Sponsor 2 for this episode is Johanna Frank. Johanna Frank, a new sponsor for Lorehaven. Discover a tale of redemption, courage, and destiny. Step into the pages of Johanna Frank's Here Lieth, an extraordinary blend of Christian fantasy and historical adventure. When a young soul faces the journey of life, the forces of darkness and light clash for the ultimate prize, his destiny. With rich, vivid storytelling and a message of hope, Here Lieth invites readers to explore themes of faith, sacrifice, and the power of choice. Perfect for fans of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, this gripping novel will captivate fantasy lovers and inspire hearts. Don't just read a story, experience a journey. Get a copy of this first in the series novel now and embark on an unforgettable adventure. This is Here Lieth from author Johanna Frank. All links and that amazing fantastical cover in the show notes for this episode 256. Going from fantasy back to science fiction, the early 2000s, at least for me, was, as I mentioned, a good time to discover at least a small batch of Christian-made stories that involved Mars in some way. And I think Zach and I mentioned this in a previous episode. Mars is the closest potentially habitable, colonizable planet to Earth. And so I think that's why it gets a lot of the attention of these stories that aim to be set in our solar system and be somewhat realistic, rather than just jumping into faster than light travel to a galaxy or solar system far, far away. Sometimes staying close to home is a good move, particularly for readers who aren't quite used to sci-fi. And that's the topic of Chapter 2, Oxygen, which flew a breathless mission into space. This released, I think, the same year as Oxygen Level Zero, book one of the original Mars Diaries series. Oxygen came from authors John B. Olson and Randall Ingermanson. And it follows a now retro-historical journey of the Ares 10 mission to Mars, a manned mission that was actually set in a real-life year, 2012, which, don't look now, kids, but 2012 was 13 years ago. We actually spoke with co-author Randall Ingermanson way back on this podcast for episode 15. I had the blessing of corresponding with him quite a bit back when that novel released because, lo and behold, he was doing some science fiction that was a little bit more near future, but still very speculative. While I was jumping ahead about a century or so, it was quite the inspiration, not just a writer myself, but as a fan. The plot is that Valkyrie Jansen is a potential astronaut. She is recruited late to the NASA program for Mars, which this part is aged particularly well. It's based on a lot of the mission architecture of Robert Zubrin, but the parts that's aged even better is that NASA, I mean, basically at that point, is all but subservient to the demands of something like reality TV. So they've got to be aware of their public image. There's some missing social media because Ingermanson and Olson were writing a decade in advance. So that would have changed the story a little bit. And yet it still works as a now retro history of this mission to Mars. And something goes wrong on the voyage over. It's really fast paced, founded in the science of its time, very, very well written, but also very human focused story. It's a fun mix of softened, hard sci-fi, which is where I live a lot of the time, a lot of mystery, and a lot of relationship drama. I think I remember seeing the pitch for Oxygen, which originally was pitched as O2. Yeah, I got granular with this one, folks. That said, it was going to be hard enough for a man, but soft enough for a woman, something like that. That may be some inside baseball there, but it works. I enjoyed this book. It was not marketed to any particular gender. In fact, there were a lot of books back then that were not so marketed. We actually have seen some more division now with a lot of the publishing happening now. Oxygen, I think, hits it right down the middle. I enjoyed it as a man. I'm sure female fans would also enjoy it. Some great characters, both men and women, plus a lot of side debates in the story. They are more at the margins about whether life on Mars would actually pose that much of a challenge to the biblical Christian faith. Would that overthrow the idea that God has created Earth and made it special? Or if you found microbes on Mars, would that prove godless evolution and thereby overthrow the entire biblical worldview? Some really great stuff in there, very sensitively handled, but certainly taking a backseat in the capsule to the human-centered story that's riding up front. I read Oxygen back when it was hot off the press. I think it was Bethany House that originally published that. And I was very happy when the family Christian stores somehow knew where I lived and then sent me a postcard. And that's how you got news back in those days, to say, hey, there's a sequel to Oxygen, and it's called The Fifth Man. So I got both books. I think I eventually got them signed by one, maybe two authors. OG copies on my shelf for Oxygen and the Fifth Man. And again, I'm really happy that I read these books actually after I started the story that over time gradually became Above the Circle of Earth. So definitely part of the inspiration there, but even better because on its own terms, it's a fantastic story about the journey to Mars, the efforts to do experiments there, some of the psychoses that can take hold when you're the only 4 people on the planet and one of y'all might be a little crazy. Really great stuff. And then at the same time, in my mind, that crew, plus or minus 1 or 2, is still on its way from Earth in my head. There was never a book 3. I'm not sure how a book 3 could have happened because it would have had to have been an Earthbound journey. So we'll have to figure out what would have happened there. Who knows? Maybe you can write your fan fiction about that. Oxygen and the Fifth Man, subject of chapter 2. Now we're going to stick with the science fiction genre, although with a more Earth-centric emphasis for Sponsor 3, moving from Fragments by J.A. Webb. He is moving quickly toward the release date for Book 2 of the Seekers series, Inheritance, which releases on May the 13th of this year. It is a dystopian thriller of deception, faith, and the fight for truth. The Order has been betrayed. The Hunters have been loosed. Father Curtis has forsaken his vows. He has left the Order and joined the Seekers, a hidden rebellion dedicated to uncovering the truth long buried by the global church. But walking away from the Order does not mean escaping its reach. When word spreads that a copy of the true text, the original 39 books of the Creator, has surfaced on the far side of the world, Curtis, Professor Ruel, and Philip embark on a desperate mission. If they can retrieve the artifact, it could change everything. If they fail, the truth will be lost forever. But the Eye of the Eternal, the secret police of the Order, has already mobilized. Their assassins are relentless, their power is absolute, and they will stop at nothing to silence the truth. Outnumbered and hunted, Curtis and his allies must risk everything to defy an empire built on deception. But against such overwhelming darkness, is faith enough, or will their inheritance, humanity's true past, be erased from history once and for all? The war for truth has begun, and the Order will not suffer heretics to live. Get Inheritance from J.A. Webb, Book 2 of the Seekers series, which will be available on May the 13th of this year. Fragments, Book 1 is already available, and you can get the info and see those sweet covers for both in our show notes for this episode 256, or for the complete archive, lorehaven.com/podcast. All right, I'm going to linger a little bit more at Chapter 3. This episode's gone a little quicker than usual. Maybe that's a good thing, but Chapter 3 has a few titles to recommend in there. These are newer novels that dig for classic sci-fi mystery on Mars. And here I'm going to mention some titles I've read, some that I have yet to read, but some books that you may want to read. And a quick disclaimer here, I'm not necessarily talking about a few Christian-made novels that will take a flyby of Mars, but don't really set a spell to explore the rocks and Olympus Mons and all of that. Some of these stories use Mars as more like a prop, kind of a quick aside, yet don't really get deep into the Red Planet. One of those, I think a listener mentioned to us a few weeks ago, is Dream Thief by Stephen R. Lawhead. It seems to deal with space travel, yet not Mars specifically. Some of the premise I read reminded me a little bit of Total Recall, which Zach mentioned in our episode, which is at least partly set on Mars, but seems to be more of a fantasy Mars in that case. Doesn't really have anything to do with Mars as a character, as a real world. It's just, some planet out there closest to Earth as you can manage to give it some air of plausibility. There was also a middle grade series in the early 90s, co-authored by Gilbert Morris, the late Gilbert Morris, called The Daystar Voyages. I have not read The Daystar Voyages. Seems like that would have been a series that I greatly enjoyed. I understand that Morris was very prolific across all kinds of genres, historical and mystery, and some fantastical stuff. His group apparently stopped by Mars a few times, but I'm a little less familiar with that. If you are familiar with that, let us know. Podcast@lorehaven.com is a good email address for you there. I have a few other novels that I found in the Lorehaven library, all of them for YA readers or older, that focused more on the Red Planet. A few of them even have the name Mars in their series title or their story title. And the first notable example I found is a trilogy that intrigues me a lot by Austin Boyd. which I have not yet had the pleasure to read, but I suspect I might enjoy it. It was called the Mars Hill Classified Series from 2006 to 2007 by author Austin Boyd. This was a 3-book series. Book 1, The Evidence, released in 2006, and so did Book 2, The Proof. And then Book 3, The Return, released in 2007. And here is the description I found for The Evidence. As Navy Commander John Wells and his crew watch hopelessly from their space station perch, terrorists cripple the nation's capital and security systems. While the world looks to the Middle East for blame, sudden images off the plains of Mars offer a staggering alternative. With a sophisticated alien culture seemingly confirmed on the Red Planet, a disorganized U.S. government struggles to formulate their next steps. Caught in a web of politics, torn by his family commitments, and called to serve not only his country but his God, John Wells must take a giant step for mankind. Now, that is a solid gold premise right there, and I wonder why I didn't hear of or read this book back then. A few quick thoughts there. First off, I'm not exactly persuaded that a lot of Christian publishers at the time knew how to handle science fiction. Some of them barely knew how to handle fantasy, but I think there was still a perception that if fantasy is not evil, it's mainly for the kids. Chronicles of Narnia, legacy stuff are fine because their authors are safe and dead. But newer fantasy, that's a little trickier. But science fiction, I think even back then, especially if you mix it with something that sounds like the plot for an end times novel, I remember being there. And I remember having these categories in my head myself as a reader and thinking, there's end times books and there's science fiction books, and ne'er the twain shall meet. Well, here is one that is meeting the twain, and I like it. I like this idea of a terrorist attack in the Middle East. I like this Earth-focused story while also having a possible alien civilization on the Red Planet. That is a darn good back cover, and I think I'm going to seek that one out. If it's still in print, maybe there's an audiobook they caught up to, or maybe I can just get the ebook on my new Kindle. That's the Mars Hill Classified Series by Austin Boyd from the mid-2000s. A newer title is by an author that I know better, Lucas Kitchen, who beat me to Missionaries on Mars by a couple of years. Lord bless you, Lucas. I bet you've had some fantastic things to say about Above the Circle of Earth. I think we have two very different angles on the subject, with Lucas's novel being a little further in the future and probably skewing a little bit younger there, while Above the Circle of Earth is literally set 100 years from this year with a cast of grown-up characters. Here's the back cover for Missionary to Mars by Lucas Kitchen. Eustace Grimes, an idealistic cyber nerd, has to go on the run when his best friends are murdered by the evil Admiral Strafe. Eustace is thrust into a solar system where just the mention of outlawed ideas can get you killed in a dozen creative ways. Since he has no ship, no money, and no connections, he is forced to sneak aboard a rattle-beaten freighter of smugglers as they set out into the wild black yonder. He embarks armed with stubbornness and an unstoppable drive to share an important message with the solar system before Admiral Strafe finds him. Now that sounds like a rip-roaring adventure yarn to me, and jumping straight into the action there. That's Missionary to Mars by Lucas Kitchen. By the way, of course, I'll have all those links and the cool covers in the show notes for this episode 256. A more recent title is by Shannon McDermott. Now, interestingly enough, I caught up with Lucas sometime last year, and he's actually written some stuff for Lorehaven. So it's a great little team up there when we can spare it. The same thing with Shannon McDermott, who actually has been a Lorehaven reviewer from the very beginning. And so to have her get this science fiction novel published by actually my publisher, Enclave Publishing, is a terrific, terrific coup. I reviewed Shannon's book for Lorehaven, and she also reviewed mine. So we have named reviews there. By the way, Shannon's next book, Singularity, releases later this year. I'm about to start on it, but this is the description for book 1 of the Eternities duology, The Time Door. A reckless last mission on Mars, a crusade for justice on Earth. Reuben Jackson is the only one who still cares about Mars. In the shambles of the Great Collapse, Earth has abandoned the Mars explorers to their fate. But Reuben will make a stand for the Mars team, even against the powerfully united politicians and scientists. In too deep, he discovers hidden conspiracies and unexpected allies. As the conflict mounts on Earth, time runs down on Mars. Left to face Mars alone, Commander Donegan Moynihan and his team have no hope of surviving after their supplies are gone. Willing to accept a quicker death than starvation, the explorers strike out on a dangerous mission. They venture deep inside the ancient volcano of Arsia Mons into perils and secrets long buried. What they discover would move mountains on Earth, but will it be enough to save themselves? This was a unique story. I had the pleasure of reading this one as well, especially because I did the interview for it, or the review for it, rather. And this is one of those stories that really harkens back to a particular flavor of classic science fiction. That is the kind of story where there is a mystery in space, you guys. There is a deep mystery that makes you feel the willies, that gives you this sense of existential, not dread, but curiosity. What's out there? What's lurking beneath the soil? What secrets are buried on Mars? What is the monolith? What is this giant ship? Now, those last two examples aren't from the Time Door, but that's the kind of tradition I'm talking about. And so that's really, in my view, that's what drives this story. There are other science fiction stories set on Mars and otherwise by Christian authors that are more about the characters, more about the ideas, like maybe little current events, like was going on with the Mars Hill Classified series, or maybe a more personal story about missionaries and what it takes to get a space mission off the ground, like my own novel, Above the Circle of Earth. The Time Door, however, it is all about the mystery. It's all about that sense of something like cosmic wonder as this secret on Mars becomes a little less secret. And then at the same time, you got some current events mixed in. This is also unique in that there is a political thriller mixed in here, a very near future political thriller. When one of the early chapters opens up with a bunch of crews burning American cash dollars because that's no longer the standard, and the dollar has just become so devalued with this new greater depression that's happening. You get the idea that, yeah, this is probably a society that can't afford to sustain the ongoing Mars mission. But this is also a parallel story about the disaster that could befall Earth and its civilizations versus, well, I'll just say whatever's going on Mars. Who would want to take away from the existential cosmic sense of mystery in The Time Door by Shannon McDermott? So you need to get that. We'll, of course, put that link in the show notes as well as the link for Singularity, which I don't think there's been a cover reveal for that yet, but I know that that's coming. I can feel it. So we'll look forward to sharing more of that at lorehaven.com. There are certainly more stories by Christians set on Mars. Maybe a flyby, maybe a settlement, maybe we will have more as Elon Musk et al. Seems to be seriously moving forward with sending a robot to Mars, and not just a probe robot, but a robot that actually looks like a robot and does stunts for social media. You could actually see one of those fellows on Mars within your lifetime, and then suddenly what was once science fiction becomes contemporary fiction, and then more Christian authors will catch up with that. Well, hopefully some of these authors, myself included, will have beaten them there, and we'll be there with the welcoming party once we get to the future hybrid genre of Amish communities on Mars, Amish romantic drama, Martian prairie romance. You can just see the more traditional Christian fiction model being very well applied once the place has been terraformed. Or maybe not. Maybe we sci-fi creators will get to keep that. But either way, I want to hear your thoughts. Listeners, what real fantastical worlds do you love to explore in science fiction? Now, Lewis and others have clarified that their worlds do not exist in our plane of existence. You can only get there one way, by magic. But with science fiction, you just need a really efficient rocket ship and a heck of a lot of training and knowledge about math. So you could, in theory, get to Mars for real. But maybe you'd want to go somewhere else. Maybe the space missions take off. Would you want to go to Mars? Would you want to visit an asteroid? Want to see the moons of Jupiter? Want to see the moons of the Saturnine system? Which ones would be your favorite starting in our solar system? So email podcast@lorehaven.com or find us on the socials. Lorehaven is on Fantastical Truth, Instagram, and X. So you can get your social media fix there, Fix. And if you like this episode, share it with a friend. We at Lorehaven want to cultivate more readers for these amazing stories so that we don't get more of them that come and go. And then even someone who runs a Lorehaven mission like myself suddenly looks at our own archives and goes, wait a minute, There was a Mars Hill Classified series. Why haven't I heard about this? So we want you to share this episode so that your friends will hear about these amazing stories. Next on Fantastical Truth, Fallen is Disney the Great. The mouse has become a dwelling place for cringe, a haunt for every unclean secularist agenda, a haunt for every flopbuster franchise, a haunt for every unclean and detestable remake. Yes, we've all heard the hot takes. We've heard the criticism. We've seen the pictures of those hapless theaters full of no one to laugh at Dopey's on-screen computer animated antics. But let's move on. From fairy stale adaptations to flippant super capers to the adrift vessels of stalled wars, how could we actually restore Disney franchises? Restoration is the name of the game. Some science fiction makes Christians nervous. There's a lot of humanism in those old stories. They're wholesome. There's a lot of good virtue and stories about coming of age and all of that. But there's also a lot of godlessness. And yet, there's everything right with science and exploration and adventure stories. God has given us these imaginations, not just to explore nonfiction or contemporary fiction or even fantasy, but also to explore these incredible new worlds right close to home in the genre of science fiction as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.